The title says I'm going to show you how to build a set of cornhole boards, but I'm actually going to show you how to build 2 sets just in case you don't have the tools that I have. Let's begin. For the first set, we're going to be using a couple 2x4s, and when we buy these, we want to try to find the ones with the least amount of knots as possible. That'll make this a lot easier. On the first 2x4, I'm actually going to rip it down widthwise, the thick part of the board here. This is actually really dangerous because it can release a lot of stresses in the wood and can potentially cause some major kickback. So if you're going to do this, please be very, very careful and cut this in stages. Don't do it in one long rip. And once I have it cut about halfway through, I'm going to rotate this board, trying to keep the same side touching the fence, and then we'll trim it all the way through. And like I mentioned earlier, when I'm making this final cut, there's a very good chance that this board might bind or even fall apart on me, so I gotta make sure my hand stays completely away from the blade. Now there's always a chance you might have a little ridge here since the blade was hitting from different sides, but it's okay. We just hit that with some sandpaper and knock that down. But overall, this looks really smooth. Now that we have the 2 boards cut in half, each one of these is going to be its own frame. So we need to decide if we're going to use the outside or the inside to make them look uniform. On this board, the outside and the inside just happen to look great. So in this case, I could use either side. Next up, we're going to use the miter saw to cut down our boards to the appropriate lengths. And in this case, it'll be right dead center of these 2 boards, which will be 48 inches. Cornhole boards are 4 foot by 2 foot. We have the 4 foot sections. Now we need to cut out some 2 foot sections, but actually we don't. They need to be a little bit different. Let me show you. First off, we need to take in consideration the thickness of our boards here, which is about 1 3/8. So take 24 inches minus 1 3/8, and we're going to end up with 22 5/8. We're actually going to need 2 boards at that length. And make sure we cut that from our second 2x4. And just like we did earlier, we're going to rip both of these down on the table saw. To assemble this, I'm just going to use some basic screws, but if you don't have screws, you can use nails or even glue. And definitely make sure you pre-drill all your holes or you're going to get some major cracks. And the first frame is together, but of course we need to make 2 of these. Next up, we need to make the legs. And I'm going to use the remaining 2x4 we had left over earlier and cut an 11.5 inch section, and that should be long enough. And then we're going to rip that on the table saw. Then we're going to take these 2 pieces and rip each of these in half as well. And one set will be for one board and one set will be for the other. Then we're going to take a large washer or something similar and place it on the top edge of our legs. This is going to do 2 things. 1, it's going to show us where we want to put our hole for our screw. And 2, it's going to show us where we need to round off the top edges of our board. And by rounding off those edges, when we install them on the inside of our boards here, it'll allow us to pivot them out of the way and not intersect with the top piece. Then going back over to our frame, we're going to make sure that the bottom is facing up. And then we're going to take one of the legs and we're going to place it over in the corner. Then we want to rotate the piece all the way up so it's in the down position, or in this case it's facing straight up, and we want to add a screw right through that hole we just drilled. Just make sure your screw is not too long and will protrude out the outside, or you're going to have to grind that off. Then your leg should be able to pivot out of the way. If by chance your leg is sticking a little bit above the top of your side frame here, that's okay. We just need to go back and sand some of this down so it doesn't interfere with our top layer. It's now time to add the top layer, you know, the one with the hole in it. And looking at the prices of 3/4 inch plywood and the prices of 1/2 inch plywood, my goodness, they are still quite expensive. But I believe I found a possible substitute. This is a hardwood underlayment plywood. It's only about 1/8 of an inch thick, but it is pretty strong. So we're going to give this a shot right here for the top. I could only find this plywood in a 4x8 sheet for about $21, but we only need about half of this for this project. So we're really only spending about 10.5. And before we make our first cut, it's always a great idea to double check our measurements. Ours is coming in at just under 24 inches, so we'll adjust to that before we make our first cut. Now that I got both of the tops cut out, I need to cut the hole. And to do that, I'm going to be using a jigsaw. Now regulation says to go from the center top down 9 inches to make a 6-inch hole. So let's do that. Here's a little tip for you when you're using the jigsaw. Remember that in most cases it cuts in an upward fashion. So we need to make sure we take our boards and take the top, the nice side that we want to see, and flip it upside down and then cut it out with the jigsaw. That way, just in case there's any jagged edges or any messed up pieces on the wood, it'll be underneath on the inside. You won't see it. And to keep these uniform, we're going to clamp these together and cut them out at the same time. To attach the top to the frame, you could use screws, nails, or possibly even some glue. But whatever you choose, I'd suggest it being flush with the top so it doesn't interfere with the bags as they land on it. You might also need some clamps and some weight in the middle to help hold it down as you're securing it in place. With the top in place, it's pretty much done, but I did notice that there's a good bit of flex right here in the middle. Now, I have just a little bit of wood left over that I was cutting down, so I'm thinking about ripping those into some strips, and then coming in here and coming in about a third from each side and putting in 2 supports, and that should make it a lot more rigid. Now, each of these frames can vary a little bit side to side, so when it comes to these strips, it's a good idea to cut them individually so we know we can get the right size. After we cut the strips to size, we want to look long ways down the board and figure out which side has the crown or the high side. One of these is going to stick out a little bit further than the other. We want to make sure that that crown, the high side, goes against the bottom of this board, and that'll provide the most strength for our setup. And if you happen to have some glue, you can always reinforce it right on the bottom where it contacts together. The boards are ready to play with, but there is one more thing I would recommend if you want these to last a long time, and that is to add some kind of exterior urethane or paint and fully coat the board in it so that it resists water and doesn't deteriorate too quickly. At the beginning of the video, I told you there's a second way to build these cornhole boards without all the fancy tools that I used. Let me show you the minimum amount I would suggest for you. And for this setup, instead of using 2x4s, we're actually going to use some 1x4 furring strips and 1x2 furring strips. The 1x4, you're going to need 3, and the 1x2, you're going to need 2. Now, this setup will cost just a few dollars more, but you don't need a table saw or a miter saw to do it. Also remember, when you're shopping for furring strips, these are usually a little bit lower quality wood. So in other words, they're not going to be as straight as your standard 2x4. In fact, when I went into the store, most of these furring strips were really bad shape, and I had to search through the pile just to find a few. And for this build, I'd recommend having a circular saw, a drill, and a jigsaw. Now, I know a lot of people don't have a jigsaw, and if by chance you don't, you could always buy an appropriate size hole saw to cut it out, and you can use that with your drill. But if by chance you do have a jigsaw, you don't need one of these. And like we did before, the 1x4s are going to be for the frames, and the 1x2 is going to be the inner support and the legs. Now, once you have your boards built, of course you're going to need some kind of a bag to throw in them. Now, I purchased both of these off of Amazon just to test them out. This one has like little beads in it, and this one has, I believe it's a sand material in it, and they both feel completely different. You'll just have to get used to whatever you'd like to play with. But you don't have to buy these. You can actually make some. If by chance you have some old bedding or maybe some old denim jeans, you can always sew them together, fill them up with sand or beans or rice. I'd probably use some kind of an inner liner, maybe like a little plastic bag to put those in so they don't get wet, otherwise they might swell. But overall, you can make your own bags and save some money that way. It's now time to take these outside and test them out. So how much did all these cost? Well, the thin plywood, like I mentioned earlier, costs about $21, and we only used about half of it, so about $10.50 for the set. Now, in this setup, we used 2 2x4s, and so they're about $3.35 a piece in our area. So all said and done, for both of these together, just would cost just under $18. Throw a couple dollars in for some real cheap nails or screws to assemble everything, we're looking at about $20 or less to build these cornhole sets. So that is awesome. Now, if you want to do the ones with the furring strips, they do cost a little bit more because you're going to have to buy a few extra materials, but you should still be able to build this for around $25 or less. Either way, great deal. I hope you can build a set of these, enjoy them with your family, and get out in the yard and have fun. Now, if you enjoyed this project, you probably should check out this next one.